You may have seen photos of Stonehenge, and possibly even visited the site, but did you know that there's a site that predates it by about 6,000 years? The site's name is Göbekli Tepe, and it's riddled archaeologists for years. It's offered many questions, but very few answers. But some of the answers that the site has actually given us are very remarkable. Like, who created it? It was created by hunter-gatherers, at a time when we didn't think hunter-gatherers were able to do something like this. And why was it constructed? That one is a little bit more ambiguous, but we think it might be a temple, but we're gonna get more into that in a little bit. But it's that time again. Get your name into a GIF in a poorly created Brad Labs video. So what do you have to do to win this week? Well, with the holiday season, I'm feeling generous. So the first 5 people to comment down in the comments, you can say whatever you want. Hi, you know, your videos are awesome. You should stop making videos. I don't really care. And I will put your name into the next video. So what makes the site of Göbekli Tepe so important? Well, if you watch the first few seconds of the video, then you know it's because of how old it is and who created it. It dates back to the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B for southwestern Asia. And if pre-pottery Neolithic means absolutely nothing to you, well, that's completely fine. That's why you're here and that's why I'm here. Let's start with the pre-pottery Neolithic A, or as we're going to refer to it from here on, PPNA. The PPNA dates back to about 9,500 to 8,500 BCE. And dates are completely fun and all, but if you have no idea what the period actually means, then what's the point of the date? So let's break it down. Let's start with Neolithic. The Neolithic started about 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. At this point, our ancestors made the rash decision to take and abandon the hunting-gathering way of life and decided to settle down for the hard work of farming. And there are a few hallmarks to the PPNA. This is when we first start to see settlements forming, reaching around 3 hectares, or 3 rugby pitches, 3 football pitches, or if you're going to be an American about it, 3 baseball diamonds. The houses that people built were primarily made out of sun-dried brick and laid out in a circular pattern, and they used lime plaster on the walls and on the floor to give it that cozy at-home feeling. But they also started to make large monuments around this time, like the Round Tower from Jericho, or the megaliths from Göbekli Tepe. And this was a time that we actually see ritual practices start to explode, like the modeled clay human figurines that you've probably seen. And also during the PPNA, we start to see the ritual practice for removing skulls, and they displayed the skulls in their houses. But during the pre-pottery Neolithic B, they took it a step further. They displayed the skulls, but they put clay over the skull, and they molded the clay to look like the person that died. And then they used seashells for the eyes. And although we haven't found any burials from Göbekli Tepe, we actually do have some human remains. And these human remains are mainly skulls. So this might have been a precursor to what the people in the PPNA and the PPN-B did. And we call those skull cults. And it was only a matter of time before I decided I was going to form my own cult. So we're going to call ourselves the Skull Cult. And if you want to be part of the Skull Cult, all you got to do is comment Skull Cult down in the comments, and you are automatically a member. And if you want to take it a step further, head over to Patreon, where you could take and rank up in the Skull Cult, because I'm going to die one day and somebody's going to have to replace me. So if you want your own cult, maybe that's the way to do it. So now that the shameless plug is out of the way, we're going to talk more about Skull Cults here in a little bit, but we need to finish talking about what the PPNA and the PPN-B are. There aren't many differences between the PPNA and the PPN-B. The biggest difference is that the PPN-B took everything from the PPNA and cranked it up to 11. But one of the biggest differences were the way that the houses were laid out. The houses went from being circular to more rectangular, and they actually had rooms. So now that we've broken down what the PPNA and PPN-B is, what does the pre-pottery in that mean? Well, they didn't have pottery yet. It wasn't until around 7000 BCE that we start to see pottery being used on a wide scale. And the use of pottery actually helped lead to population growth, and eventually those ashtrays that all of our parents have somewhere in their house. Let's talk about who created Göbekli Tepe. It was created by hunter-gatherers, either in the 9th or 10th millennium BCE, and the site is huge, at 9 hectares, and it's estimated there's around 20 circular temples at the site. These circular temples are stone enclosures that were set into the ground, and they measure anywhere from 10 to 30 meters across. And inside each of these circular temples are T-shaped pillars. Some of them have decoration, some of them don't. And each enclosure does contain 10 of these megaliths running around the outside, and 2 sitting in the middle. And most of these T-shaped pillars stand about 3 meters in height. There was one that was unfinished, but if it had been done, it would have been about 6 meters in height. The pillars are carved out of limestone. Some of them have decorations and some of them don't. But the reliefs that we do find are mostly of animals, like gazelles, snakes, foxes, and lions. And there are some that have more abstract carvings on them. And I can't stress enough that the site was made by hunter-gatherers, so to expel the energy to create these temples is already truly amazing. But then when they were finished with the temple, they would actually bury it, and I mean that literally. They would bury it under 3 to 5 meters of soil, and then they would just start a new temple, either directly on top of or next to where the old temple was at. And why they did this might be held in what the site actually is. It's possibly ritualistic. According to Klaus Schmidt, the lead archaeologist on the site was used for ceremonial and religious purposes. So why is it so amazing that hunter-gatherers created this site? Well, hunter-gatherers didn't have farming, so they didn't have a surplus of food. They tend to hunt and gather only what their group would need, and they live in small groups that only come together occasionally to exchange goods, ideas, or even people, because even they know becoming a Habsburg is not something anybody wants. So now you're probably asking, how do we know they were hunter-gatherers? Well, it's what they left behind, and what they didn't leave behind. We don't have any signs of permanent structures at the settlement other than for the temples themselves. But what is the one thing that humans leave behind no matter where we go? If you answered poop, you're technically correct, but it's also trash. We tend to leave a lot of stuff behind. We're able to tell more about who the people were that created the site. They left behind flint tools like knives, choppers, and projectile points. And it's not uncommon to find these things where hunter-gatherers went. What is uncommon is how many we found at the site. But the other thing that we find in large quantities are animal bones. And these were bones from non-domesticated animals, like gazelles, which by 2004, we'd recovered around 7,949 of these gazelle bones. The next closest was the aurochs. But the one thing that we do find lacking at the site is any domesticated animals or grains. We do find those in the newer layers, but the earlier layers dating back to around the 10th millennium BCE don't have any of that. So if they hadn't started farming yet, did they have metal tools? No, they used flint to carve out all these megaliths. And I got curious too, because I kind of figured that flint was going to be weaker than limestone. It turns out I was wrong. Flint falls on the Mohs scale of hardness at around a 7, while limestone only falls between a 2 and a 3, which even if they did have metal like copper, flint would still take and knock copper out of the ballpark, because copper's only got a Mohs hard scale of around 3 or 4. So this means that flint was actually more efficient than a metal tool in this case. The site is thought to have been constructed because it was temples for ritualistic purposes, but there are a couple other theories out there, and it would only be fair to cover those. The first theory is that it was built for astronomical purposes. The theory says that they used the star Sirius to align the temples, and the theory is from the people that worshipped the star Sirius thousands of years after the temple was built. So this one's kind of a long stretch. And on top of that, the lead archaeologist says that these temples were probably covered. There would be no reason to look at the sky. But there's another theory in the astronomical camp, and that has to do with a comet. And this one just says that it recorded the impact of a comet. But both of these theories have been rejected by the archaeologists that are running the site. The archaeologists that are digging the site suggest that this is actually the world's first temples. At the beginning of the video, I talked about skull cults, and the fact that we found no human remains other than for skulls, but we've also found some vertebrae, but those are less important than the skulls that we have found. These fragments of human skulls were actually found mixed among the animal bones. Now this doesn't necessarily mean cannibalism, I mean that's where my brain immediately jumped to, but this was possibly ancestor worship instead. The skull fragments that we've recovered do have cut marks on them, and these cut marks were for defleshing, so how do we know this was ancestor worship and not cannibalism? The ancestor worship of skulls was prevalent in this area not too long after the temples were constructed, and with the people that created the temples being hunter-gatherers, they more than likely buried their dead somewhere along the migration path, and then when they knew they were going back to Göbekli Tepe, they would have dug up the dead, decapitated them, because the cut marks show no signs of healing, and there's actually a little bit of decay on the skulls already. They would have then brought the skulls to Göbekli Tepe to send their ancestor off in style, and there's one skull that stands out above the others, called Skull 1. It was recovered in a cluster of ochre, and there's evidence that ochre was smeared on the skull before it was placed in this cluster of ochre. They also modified the skull by drilling a hole into the top of the skull. It's believed that they would have done this to either hang the skull to display for everybody to see, or the hole was used to affix a mask or some kind of decoration to the skull. Let's talk about the archaeology of the site now. The site is still undergoing archaeology and has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but the site wasn't always thought to be what it is today. When the site was originally found in the 1960s, they wrote it off as a medieval cemetery and didn't bother doing any more looking into it. But luckily for us, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt in the 1990s decided that he was going to take a closer look at it. In 1994, he went out and examined the site, and what he found was truly remarkable, enough so that the next year he came back with 5 other archaeologists to start excavations. They quickly discovered signs at the temples, partially because it was so close to the surface, enough so that plows had actually done damage to the site already. They started to give the temples numbers from A to G, and what they found was the temples E, F, and G don't share the grandiose scale that the earlier temples do. The enclosures and the pillars in these later temples tend to be smaller, but they still maintain that layout of 10 megaliths around the inside of the circle and 2 standing in the middle. And thanks to Schmidt just finding a simple passage written by the University of Chicago that passed this off as a medieval cemetery, we now have this amazing site that has reworked the way we think about hunter-gatherers. Like, why would they come together and expel energy that they don't really need to expel to create something like this? Was it to worship their gods? Was it just to bring people together, to give them a common purpose, to exchange ideas and goods and people? And these are questions that we can really only speculate on until we find a time travel machine and we can go back and actually figure things out. But that's one of the great things about archaeology, is having these questions and then trying to find the answers for them. So until next time, Skull Cult, I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I want to thank you all for watching, and I want to thank the people here on screen right now. They're the crew over at Patreon. They help make all this possible. If you want to help support the channel, then head over to Patreon, and for as little as $2 Canadian a month, you can get extra content and rank up in the Skull Cult.